Hello, everybody. So this is one of the most fun things that a dean gets to do, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you as we honor our dear friend and colleague, Glenn Cohen, as he assumes his appointment as the very first James A. Attwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law. So let's... Now, I've tried to make this as short as possible, but there are a lot of people I need to not only mention, but talk about. And I'm going to start by welcoming Glenn's family, his parents, Bert and Ginger Cohen, who flew up from Miami, not Canada anymore. So, okay, from Miami for this lecture, and his brother Jonathan and his husband Jesse Ayala. So welcome all of you. Thank you for being here. And before I turn to the great Glenn Cohen, I have a few words to say about this new professorship. And so there'll be three people I'll be talking about in conjunction with this professorship, and you'll see why in a little bit. Now, one of the great things about this job is that you get to know some really terrific human beings who also are our alumni and who love the alma mater and who give deans and faculty and the community great advice and support. And Jim Attwood and Leslie Williams are two such people. Both are graduates of the class of 1984, so we were here at the same time during the Lost Generation, and we didn't know one another then, but we do now. They met each other their very first year at HLS, I understand, in a corporations class taught by Bob Clark. So there you go for the 1L elective, right? Corporations. And you know, the rest is history, as they say. Jim is a JD MBA. He spent a long time at Goldman Sachs. He then joined what was at the time one of the few non-AT&T phone companies, GTE. And which was later acquired by, so tell me if I've got the corporate reorg right, was later acquired by Bell Atlantic and then became Verizon. And so in this job, Jim played a key role in forming Verizon and creating Verizon Wireless. So that's pretty consequential work. And he then went on to become a managing director of the Carlyle Group, where he led the firm's investment in global telecommunications, media, and technology, and helped bring about the revolution in modern communications. So Jim, so that's Jim, a life in telecommunications. So after starting out practicing law, Leslie went on to find her passion in promoting healthy eating and food safety. So beginning in 2006, Leslie founded and ran The Perennial Chef, a restaurant and catering business that focused on local, seasonal, and organic ingredients. She's also a champion of the environment. She serves on several boards, including Riverkeeper, which, as many of you may know, is dedicated to preserving the integrity of the beautiful and important Hudson River. She's also on the board of Earth Justice, which started out as Sierra Club's legal defense fund and is the premier environmental litigation outfit in the world. So Jim and Leslie have done great things, and among other things, they have been among our most dedicated supporters at Harvard Law School. Jim's been on the Dean's Advisory Board for almost a decade and just finished really spectacular service as co-chair of the Campaign for the Third Century. Jim and Leslie have made really important commitments to our annual fund and to the Attwood Williams Scholarship. And then the reason we're all here tonight, they also endowed the chair that Glenn now holds. Now, here's a special thing about this chair that some of you know, but maybe not all of you know. And that's why I said there are three people that are involved in this introduction. So when Martha Minow decides to retire, which I hope will be many, many decades from now, this chair will become the Martha Minow Professorship of Law. So it's a really great thing. Now, in this way, Jim and Leslie have recognized Martha's singular contributions to human knowledge through her scholarship, the gift that she has given to generations of students through her teaching and mentorship. And I'll add at this moment that she was Leslie's third-year paper advisor, by the way, and also Martha's really exceptional leadership of this law school in her 8 years as dean. In that role, as Jim and Leslie saw firsthand, Martha steered the law school through perilous financial times, continued to expand the excellence and diversity of our faculty, invested heavily in financial aid and experiential education, and inspired curricular innovation that has moved us firmly into the 21st century. By honoring the incomparable Martha Minow, Jim and Leslie showed not only generosity, but also selflessness and plain old good judgment. They are true friends of this law school. Now, to show that this is, not just words, right? We have something for you. And you'll never guess what it is. I'm just going to say it's very nice. And would you like to come up and see it? Or it's right here. Yes, please come up. I think the two of you should. It's this one over here. There's another thing there that we're not going to say what it is. So if you just unveil it. And here's what the plaque. There's a plaque on the back, and here's what it says: Harvard Law School, in grateful appreciation, the James A. Attwood and Leslie Williams Professorship of Law, 2018, for the year that it was endowed. So thank you again very, very much. All right, and now on to tonight's honoree, the James A. Attwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law himself, Glenn Cohen. Glenn is a superb teacher, scholar, and as director of the Petrie-Flom Center, generates impactful research into health law and policy. It is impossible to do justice to all that Glenn does. And I know you want to hear from Glenn himself, so I'm going to try to make this as brief as I can, but Glenn, you don't make it easy. There's a lot to say about you. Okay, so Glenn is a graduate of the class of 2003 and a first-generation law student, and he joined our faculty in 2008, and 5 years later earned tenure. I was on Glenn's tenure committee, and what I can tell you is that the depth and quality of his work, even then, early in his career, was just astonishing. He focuses on a rapidly changing field that becomes more important by the day, bioethics. And in that field, Glenn combines a deep practical knowledge of what goes on in the world with a principled understanding of the ethical implications of new approaches. He is now the author, co-author, or editor, are you ready for this? 12 books and countless articles. His work is frequently cited and covered in national media. His articles have appeared not only in law reviews, but this is amazing, in peer-reviewed journals and in peer-reviewed medical journals. Very, very impressive. In no time at all, Glenn has become one of the most influential scholarly voices on health law and bioethics. All right, as faculty director, now on to his role as faculty director of the Petrie-Flom Center. In that role, Glenn has expanded the frontiers of health law, bioethics, and biotechnology. He's helped make Harvard a critical hub for healthcare and bioethics scholarship. I want you just to think about the list of subjects that I'm about to recite. Ready? Big data, health information technologies, mobile health, reproductive technology, research ethics, organ transplantation, rationing in law and medicine, health policy, FDA law, translational medicine, and medical tourism. That seems pretty important, right? These are only some of the issues that Glenn and the Petrie-Flom Center are now tackling. But that's not all. Glenn is an amazing teacher at a time when we need amazing teachers. He teaches not only health law, but also civil procedure, and he's a 1L section leader. And Glenn spends a lot of time at the beginning of the year doing exercises that help students learn about one another and develop the kind of mutual trust and understanding that enables them to have productive, collegial, and respectful learning experience and to talk about hard questions respectfully and with collegiality. There's no other way to put it. Glenn's students love him. They learn a ton from him. And because of the careful work he does, they also learn a ton from one another too. Glenn Cohen is already early in his career in the pantheon of legendary Harvard Law School teachers. Now, I could go on and on about Glenn Cohen, and maybe some of you think I already have. But one thing I do, see, now this is getting to my next point. One thing I know about Glenn is this: he does not like it when speakers exceed their allotted time. And I am beginning to feel a disturbance in the force. But I cannot end without saying something personal about Glenn. So over the past 2 years, Glenn has been an invaluable member of the leadership team at Harvard Law School. He has been a tireless and insightful member of the entry-level appointments committee. He's been, as I mentioned, an exceptional section leader. He's helped us innovate our writing program, and he is the executive producer and guiding spirit of the 0L course, which we launched last summer as a pre-enrollment online course that gives our incoming students a basic knowledge of our legal system and the vocabulary of law school. And Glenn put his heart and soul into creating a wonderful course that enables all of our students to start with a common baseline and to come to Harvard Law School excited and ready to learn. And that's a big accomplishment. Glenn, you're a superb law professor and a superb human being. When your remarks are done, I will leap back up here and there'll be another gift to unveil. And again, you'll never guess what it might be. I will say I feel fortunate indeed to be your colleague and to be your friend. So without further delay, I give you the James A. Attwood and Leslie Williams and future Martha Minow Professor of Law, Glenn Cohen.
Thank you all very much. An occasion like this happens maybe once in a career, so I hope you'll pardon me if I do a few thank yous first. First of all, I have to say a huge thank you to my deans, to Martha and to John. Working with you has been such a joy over the last several years and really one of the highlights of my life. I want to thank my wonderful colleagues in the room. I often tell my students, and it's true, that it's a privilege to feel like the dumbest person in the room at Harvard Law School, because every day you amaze me with the things you know, and I feel like I get a graduate school education in just about every other field. I want to thank my students, and in particular my research assistants, who've helped me a lot with some of this material. I want to thank you, thanks to my Petrie-Flom Center staff, who do an amazing job supporting me and extending me and also working with me to really conquer mountains. I want to thank Einar L. Haig in particular, where's Einar, there he is, who saw me as a young person and said, this is somebody who has maybe a modicum of talent, and really shaped me into the scholar I am as a fellow, and also gave me the wonderful gift of the Petrie-Flom Center, which he founded. I want to thank my amazing husband, Jesse, who brings laughter and creativity to our life. I want to thank Jim and Leslie for the amazing gift they've given us in terms of this chair. I want to thank my brother, my Aunt Marilyn, who are here, and I want to thank my parents. As John said, I am a first-generation student and a proud one. I'm They're proud of me, but I'm even more proud of them in that neither of my parents finished high school, but they managed to carve out an amazing life for themselves. I'm really, really grateful for that. I'll tell one story about my parents in a second, but last thing I want to say is to thank my amazing assistant, Jennifer Minich, who really supports me wonderfully and lets me do the work that I love to do. Okay, normally the topic today is about sex, and normally one would be reticent about talking about sex in front of one's parents, but you've obviously not met my parents. Because, and I'll just give you one anecdote. So, I had my parents sit in on civil procedure a couple of years ago for a class. They were in town. I thought it would be fun. And it just so happened it was the Nicastro case, which for those of you in the know is about personal jurisdiction, but happens to be about a steel cutting machine. And my dad is in the steel business. And so one of the facts of the case is about the ties to New Jersey involving conventions about steel. And I know my father had gone to a number of these conventions. So, of course, in the middle of class, thinking this was really clever and fun, I said, Mr. Cohen, can you tell us a little bit about what these steel conventions are like? And my father said, oh, they're wonderful. They're wonderful, wonderful junkets. And in fact, you were conceived at one in Hawaii, ... My students broke out laughing. I turned bright red. And since then, my parents have never been invited back to a class that I'm teaching. But that tells you the kind of people they are. So, as I said, this talk is about sex in some senses, and sometimes there's reproduction without sex. Transplanted uteruses, children with 3 genetic parents, babies made from skin. This sounds like the tropes of science fiction, from Brave New World to Star Trek. But as with technologies like submarines and smartphones that start as science fiction, they are rapidly becoming science fact. The title of this talk is the tentative title for a new book I'm working on, The Second Reproductive Revolution. It's only a so-so title, so if you have better ideas, please send it my way. And I want to explore 5 cutting-edge reproductive technologies in a sort of group biography, if you will. They are egg freezing, uterus transplants, mitochondrial replacement therapy, gene editing, and in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG for short, which I'll explain in a few minutes, is actually deriving embryos from skin cells or other adult cells. The goal is to show how these technologies might remake society and the ethical and legal challenges that are associated with them. It also tells the very human stories behind the creators and users of these new technologies. The new book is ideally going to be aimed for a more lay audience. I haven't actually ever written for that kind of audience before, so it's going to be an interesting challenge. And I'm hoping to break ground on it this summer. So you're getting the proposal, and maybe during the Q&A you'll tell me to change things, which would be very helpful. So the future really is now. The first children born through uterus transplantation, mitochondrial replacement, gene editing happened in the last 7 years. Egg freezing has been around a lot longer, but its use for fertility preservation, as opposed to cancer treatment, for example, is relatively recent. IVG has been done in mammals, including from 2 females without a male contribution, so producing a child from 2 female mammals, not humans, without any male involved, but not humans yet. And again, the goal of the book is to examine these technologies. And let me jump right into it. First, disclosures. I've got none. I'm not promoting anything. I'm going to talk about some technologies, but I'm not promoting anything. Okay. So the title of the book is The Second Reproductive Revolution, and that implies that there's a first reproductive revolution. What do I mean by that? Well, I make the claim that the first reproductive revolution happened in 1978 with the birth of Louise Brown in Manchester, United Kingdom, the first baby born through in vitro fertilization, or IVF for short. That's the fertilization of an egg outside the human body. This breakthrough has enabled millions of infertile individuals to reproduce. In the US alone, there's been at least 1 million babies born through IVF since 1987, when we had the first US birth. IVF also paved the way for a series of refinements and extensions, including gestational surrogacy, whereas a man's sperm is combined with a woman's egg, but a separate woman carries the baby to term, as well as other technologies like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where at the 8-cell stage we take up 1 cell, we biopsy it, and we determine whether the embryo is the best among a lot for implantation. Now, to be sure, there's nothing sacrosanct about this date of 1987. Some would argue the revolution actually occurred earlier. It may surprise you to learn that the first artificial insemination, of dogs to be sure, occurred in 1870 by the Italian priest Lazzaro Spallanzani. Let me do that one more time. Spallanzani, that's much better, I think. My Italian friends watching, sorry about that. And then in humans in 1785 by the Scottish surgeon John Hunter. And indeed, the first artificial insemination by donor happened here in the United States by William Pancoast in Philadelphia. Now, for my colleagues who study constitutional law and the history of this country and the amendments to the Constitution, I often think it's kind of funny that all of these techniques are being developed alongside the way this country is being developed and its constitutional structure. Artificial insemination was relatively important, but as a legal or social matter, it was less of a game changer than IVF. Law in particular was able to relatively quickly accommodate it into existing law paradigms, in particular family law paradigms. And intriguingly, the very first cases involving it actually are about adultery. Was it adultery to use artificial insemination by donor if you couldn't conceive? I don't think that's coincidental. If you'll permit me a little bit of an aside, the longer arc of laws grappling with these technologies is one of an attempt to assimilate that which is disruptive into existing paradigms of what families look like. Paradigms that in some instances, I think, look quite patriarchal. But I want to argue that the second reproductive revolution, the one we're about to undergo or are undergoing right now, promises to be very different from the first in myriad ways. Telescoping very briefly a large amount of legal and sociological literature about these technologies, I will argue that while breakthrough and disruptive, the first reproductive revolution was really about mimicking that which was available through sexual reproduction. And the legal treatment of these technologies was able to accommodate them into existing paradigms of family law and other allied topics. The second reproductive revolution, by contrast, is less focused on mimicking traditional reproductive technologies. Rather, it's focused on extending them. Egg freezing extends the period in which women can have genetic children, and in so doing may disrupt employment, family structures, gender equality, and the prominence of grandparents. Uterus transplants can literally create life, pregnancy from death cadavers, and disrupts our idea of what a transplant is for. In the case of living uterus donors, it introduces a new personage into the reproductive context. And in a possible future, these transplants may actually allow men to be pregnant in the future. Mitochondrial replacement therapies add a second genetic mother who might have rights or duties to the children born. Gene editing disrupts the notion that reproduction is a chancy activity where we all have to deal with the chance we get and moral luck, and instead moves from chance to choice. And finally, IVG shakes to the core our views about what genetic parenthood is all about. In a world where thousands of embryos are created from my adult skin cells, with or without my permission, will the institution of parenthood ever be the same? These are just a smattering of the issues raised by the second reproductive revolution. From the constitutional perspective, the second reproductive revolution is likely to require the US Supreme Court to answer a series of questions it and the lower courts have assiduously avoided. To what extent, if at all, do the existing lines of constitutional cases about abortion, Skinner, the contraception cases, apply in the case of new reproductive technologies? From either a doctrinal or a normative perspective, a political theoretical one, does the line between mimicking versus extending matter? That is, does the Constitution or our polity owe us non-interference rights or perhaps even rights of assistance when it comes to the ability of the infertile to achieve what the fertile have, but instead the claim to go beyond what the fertile have? What do we think about what are sometimes called the dysfertile, single individuals or gays and lesbians, who by social rather than medical reasons need reproductive assistance to propagate? I suggest that these confrontations are much more likely with the second reproductive revolution, in part because for many of these technologies, the US government has taken a prohibitory stance, one that will inevitably be challenged in court. Okay, now let's start talking about some of these technologies in slightly greater depth. First, egg freezing. This is the first chapter of the book, tentatively titled Frozen Feminism, ? Many young women, including our students who become young associates who I meet at their law school reunions, face huge pressures to balance their professional success with their desire to at least at one point reproduce. The trade-off is very real, especially in a world of law firms, consulting firms, and the like that make huge demands on women. Other women have just not found the right person to settle down with, and the entire language of settling, to sound a little bit like a Sex and the City outtake, if you will, poses serious questions for individuals. For a long time, these women had a few options. They could reproduce early, take a risk. They could hold off and hope that their reproductive fortunes would sustain them later on when they decided to have families. Or, a step very rarely taken, they could get donor sperm, they could fertilize an egg, and they could freeze the embryo. But there was another technology emerging for medical needs, in particular the reality that for some women, treating them for cancer might affect their fertility. The technique is known as vitrification, but it's colloquially referred to as egg freezing. In the last decade or so, the technique was improved so that it could produce much better results. By December 2012, around 18,000 eggs had been flash frozen in the UK, 580 embryos created, 160 cycles of IVF undertaken, and 20 live births have resulted just in the UK. Vitrification enables mature ova to be preserved once harvested without producing the damaging crystals that other slower forms of freezing produced. It was the emergence of this technique in the late 1990s that meant egg freezing became much more of a viable option for women facing cancer treatment. In January 2013, though, not without controversy I should add, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine declared the technology was no longer experimental. At the same time, it cautioned, it was careful to warn against reliance on it for elective use to defer childbearing, noting that marketing this technology for the purpose of deferring childbearing might give women false hope and encourage women to delay childbearing. In particular, there is a concern regarding the success rates in women in the late reproductive years who may be the most interested in this application. Well, the market didn't really listen. In late 2014, both Facebook and Apple made headlines by announcing they would cover the procedure for female employees, a development that garnered a huge amount of attention. The procedure is still very expensive if you're paying on your own, with harvesting costing in the ballpark of $10,000 and storage costing several $100s a year, being physically invasive with a wide range of medical effects. Of perhaps the greatest concern, the success rates for women drop rapidly as women age. The procedure is effectively a lottery for women over the age of 40, and there's a substantial chance of failure for even women in their 30s. What has followed, though, has been fascinating from a sociological perspective. Are you worried about your eggs? If you're getting older, you should be, and that's why it's time to party. So goes one of the big tropes here, which are egg freezing parties that I've put up here on the screen. Dr. Amy, this is another one, Evazadeh, whom you can see pictured, would have you believe that this is a great opportunity for women. She's a San Francisco-based fertility expert, and she calls herself, I'm not joking, the egg whisperer. The egg whisperer. She has thrown over 40 egg freezing parties in the US and online via webinars, and such parties target women in large urban areas who are worried about their fertility. Is it really such a good idea for young women to undergo hormone treatments and relatively minor surgery, not to deal with infertility, but to give themselves, quote unquote, options in the future, should they not find a reproductive partner in the near or middle term? Is this a triumph of 21st century feminism, telling women to take charge of their reproductive futures and explode the seeming binary of work versus family? Or is it instead a new instantiation of what's been called the motherhood machine? The tendency of reproductive technologies to instead reify traditional concepts of what being a real woman means, which involves not only motherhood, but genetically related motherhood. Does it really make sense for women to undergo risks for possible future they may never need to use the eggs for? To better understand the experience of the women who've taken up egg freezing, I review some of the sociological studies and qualitative interviews of these women, and then the chapter jumps into some of the legal and ethical issues raised by the technology. Are women banking on the promise of egg freezing to their detriment? Is there enough data on the use of this technology that this is not fraud on the market? Are the claims made by those pushing the option more selling than science? To what extent should elective egg freezing be covered by health insurance? It can be prohibitively costly to many, creating haves and have-nots in terms of which women get access to these options. On the other hand, is this really a healthcare need or is this a want? For employers, including Google and Apple and leading law firms, just to name a few, that do cover this technology, what's the message they're sending? We support you in your reproductive choices, or we expect you to delay your motherhood and work nonstop during the years that most women actually reproduce. How will anti-discrimination law treat women who elect not to freeze their eggs as against women who do freeze their eggs in terms of promotion and the like? Some are concerned with motherhood late in life and the sake of the children that are born. Is that a cogent way of thinking about this, harm to those who don't yet exist? What should we make about the external social effects? For example, the possibility that there will be a generation of children born without grandparents. And what happens to all those eggs frozen in the future that are never used? Will this generate a more robust egg banking industry where many women will try to recoup the investments they made earlier in their lives by selling those eggs? And how do we feel about that? Would an egg banking industry that looks like our current sperm banking industry be a step forward for gender parity or a step backwards? That's all one chapter. Okay, pause for water. You can read the fine print if you want while I do. Chapter 2, borrowed wombs. All about uterus transplants. 1 in 500 women suffer from uterine factor infertility. Women who were born without a uterus lost their uterus, or their uterus no longer functions. Historically, the condition meant that some women had no chance to ever have a pregnancy. That reality changed for one woman in December 2017, with the first child born through a uterus transplant in the United States at Baylor in Texas. There had been a few prior births in Sweden. While the mother has understandably preferred to keep her identity private, the chapter opens by telling the story of the stranger who donated her uterus for a transplant. Taylor Seiler, then 37, who you can see pictured up there with her husband. A nurse herself, Seiler had considered becoming a gestational surrogate, but as a mother of 2 young boys, she worried this would be too disruptive. When she saw an ad from Baylor recruiting women to be possible donors, she couldn't believe we had come this far from the technology. And here I quote her. "I have family members who struggle to have babies, and it's not fair," said Seiler. "I just think that if we can give more people that option, that's an awesome thing," unquote. Seiler didn't know the woman who would carry her womb, but they exchanged letters the day of the surgery, and Seiler was given another letter to let them know the recipient was pregnant. Quote, "I've just been crying, getting teary thinking about it. I think about her every day, and I probably will for the rest of my life," unquote. Now, transplanting a uterus is a major undertaking. A potential uterus donor will be extensively screened through months-long process, including lab work, radiology tests, psychological evaluation, extensive paperwork, all of which Seiler had to complete. At that point, the donor will undergo surgery to have her uterus removed, surgery that carries with it the pain, risk, and complications associated with other kinds of transplants. The procedure is also taxing on the woman who receives the uterus. She will go on immunosuppressive drugs to prevent her body rejecting the uterus and undergo an extensive surgery to transplant the donor uterus onto her pelvis. After a few months, she will start having her period, and within 12 months of the transplant, the uterus will hopefully be healed well enough to take embryos for implantation. She will undergo pregnancy with a C-section delivery and then undergo a hysterectomy after 1 to 2 childbirths to remove the donor uterus. Once it's removed, she can go off the immunosuppressive drugs, which is much healthier for her, but the uterus is not returned to the donor. While in Seiler's case, you borrow something. I bet you borrowed wombs is a little bit of an unfair title. It's more like, given wombs. While in Seiler's case, the uterus came from a living stranger. In other reported cases, it's been donated by a family member, a mother or a sister. In still other cases, it's actually come from a dead body. Literally life being brought into being and nurtured from death. It may also be possible in the future, the science is not there yet, to transplant uteruses onto the male pelvis, allowing trans women or men to experience pregnancy. There have now been several successful transplants in the United States that have produced babies, and I have photos of the first 2 babies born in the US in November 2017 and February 2018, now roughly 1 year old, and their mothers' faces are not shown. After giving the medical background and telling the story of people like Seiler, the chapter jumps into a set of vexing legal, social, and ethical questions. In reported cases, uteruses have come from mothers, sisters, or aunts of the recipient. That makes sense given that this is a major undertaking. But do we have concerns about the family pressure in this case? Should a woman who donates her uterus in such a situation have any claim, legal or social, to a special kind of relationship with the child? For example, if a woman donates her uterus to her daughter, might we think of her as a genetic grandmother, but a uterine mother? And should we treat her any different from any other grandma in terms of visitation rights? Think about the Supreme Court's decision in Troxel. Seiler was a donor in every sense. She wasn't paid. There are very few women, though, who'd be willing to do this for a stranger without being paid. Should we allow compensation? We don't allow you to sell a kidney, but we do allow you to sell sperm or egg. Which is this one more like? It's no accident that the countries where this technology has been developed are in places that are hostile to surrogacy. For women with uterine infertility, surrogacy is another option. And the question is, how should we think about these 2 alternatives together? With surrogacy, it is the surrogate who bears the physical burdens of pregnancy and the psychological risk of forming an attachment to the soon-to-be child. With uterine transplants, the health risks are concentrated on the woman receiving the transplant. Should countries with ethical concerns about surrogacy insist that women do uterine transplants instead? How should the policy about these two medical options overlap? Uterus transplants are very expensive. Should the state pay for it the way it pays for kidneys, for example, or heart transplants? Or again, is this a medical want rather than a medical need? Where it is possible to have a genetically related child through another means, is the uterus transplant, the person who wants it, really asserting a right to be pregnant or a right to experience pregnancy, as opposed to a right to be a genetic parent through another means? Is that a right that should have constitutional bona fides? Is it a weaker right than the right to use IVF, for example, or sperm donation? Is this something we should pay for, either directly from the public fisc or privately? And how do all these issues look different when it's men involved? Could we imagine men making a claim about a right to be pregnant and saying the state ought to at least not interfere or possibly pay for it? Is this a welcome step in the direction of gender equality, or does it instead take away from women one thing that is special about their sex? How do different branches of feminism think about that? Okay. 3 genetic parents, chapter 3, mitochondrial replacement therapies. So as you might dimly remember from science class, the mitochondria are part of the cell whose primary function is to generate energy. There are a terrible set of diseases known as mutant mitochondrial diseases, or mtDNA diseases. They create terrible damage to the brain, heart, liver, and other systems of children who are born with it. As many as 15,000 US women are at risk of giving birth to a child afflicted with these diseases, and about 1,000 children are born every year with the disease. There's no cure. Moreover, parents who carry the disease yet wish to have genetically related children can't rely on earlier technologies like PGD to scan for these diseases. Nonetheless, there is hope in sight. Mitochondrial replacement therapies, MRT for short, offers the possibility for having genetically related children without the disease through an amazing technology that adds a third genetic parent to the mix. The chapter offers some scientific background on MRT, but to simplify greatly, the nuclear DNA of one woman is combined with the mitochondrial DNA of another woman, and then that egg is fertilized with the sperm of the intended father. In fact, the child thus has 3 genetic parents, 2 women and a man, although the woman who donates the mitochondria is giving a very, very small percentage of the DNA, and one, though it's somewhat contested, is not thought to express itself in the kinds of traits the children inherit. But the mitochondrial DNA donor is a mother. She's a genetic mother, making these the first set of children to have 3 separate genetic parents. The chapter will explain the science, but then tell some of the stories. These include the story of Sharon Bernardi. I've shown a photo of her here with one of her children. She's a British woman who lost a total of 7 children to mitochondrial diseases. She felt fine during the pregnancies and the births went well, and then quickly something started to go wrong. She had 3 stillbirths before, then each of her 3 next children died within hours of the birth and no one knew why. By the time of her next pregnancy, the doctors were more prepared. When her son Edward, pictured alongside his mom, was born, for his first 48 hours, Edward received drugs and blood transfusions to prevent the lactic acidosis that had killed his siblings. 5 weeks later, she and her husband Neil were allowed to take their child home for Christmas. Edward lived, but had very significant health deficits, diagnosed as the mitochondrial disease of Leigh syndrome. He died at age 21. They tried again 3 more times, but each of the children died before the age of 2. After telling these kinds of stories, the chapter will then pivot to sketch the legal landscape governing MRT. After a long public consultation process, including 13 years of preclinical and animal data and pivotal debates in Parliament, the UK has allowed the technology to be used under circumstances the chapter will describe. In contrast, the MRT is currently prohibited in the US by dint of a rider, a congressional appropriations rider on the FDA, that appears was more targeted for the next subject we'll talk about, which is gene editing. One of the consequences of this difference between regulatory regimes has been kind of medical tourism. I wrote a book about this a few years ago, Patients with Passports, in that people are traveling abroad for the technology. Indeed, one New Jersey reproductive technologist, Dr. Zhang, the founder and CEO of the medical director of the New Hope Fertility Center, and someone who's known for pushing the boundaries in this area, allegedly helped a Jordanian couple whose 2 prior children had died from Leigh syndrome to conceive a new child via MRT. He did ovarian stimulation, manipulation of the eggs, fertilization in a clinic in New York, but in an attempt to avoid US law, they then took the embryos to Mexico, to Guadalajara, where they were transferred in an affiliated clinic there. Many in the reproductive health community were upset at some of the lapses they saw in informed consent and the like and oversight. But it turns out this didn't work for Dr. Zhang. The FDA sent him a cease and desist letter accusing him of violating the Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act based on the work he had done in New Jersey and asking him to address the violations. This is not the only instance of this. About 10 days ago, Spanish doctors traveled to Greece to perform mitochondrial replacement. Not to avoid disease in this case, and this is fascinating, but to help a 32-year-old who had previously been through 4 unsuccessful IVF cycles on the theory that her mitochondria are part of the problem with fertility. With this personal, scientific, and legal background, we're ready once again to jump into some of the vexing questions. How many parents are there in MRT? Socially, legally? Do women who donate mitochondrial DNA, who are but-for causes of the children who come into existence, indelibly wrapped into the genes, count as mothers? Should they have any legal rights or any duties? Interestingly, in countries that require the identification of anonymous sperm and egg donors, like the UK, they explicitly exempted mitochondrial donor. Is that right? Is it about the percentage of genetic material you give, or is it about something else? In deciding about these kinds of technologies, how should we weigh the interests of women carrying a mutant mtDNA in having children genetically related to them, that which most fertile people are able to do, against concerns for the welfare of the children born, and the claim by some that this crosses a red line into germline gene editing that will undermine the integrity of the human genome? Along the way, do we think about things like the importance of genetic connection, the claims that prohibiting MRT would be a kind of disability or genetic discrimination, how to think about harm to resulting children who will not exist but for allowing the technology to go forward, and whether, as the National Academies proposed, we should limit this to male-only reproduction to minimize the chance that the mitochondrial alterations will be passed forward to the next generation. But if we did that, that would be a form of state-ordered sex selection. Is that constitutionally problematic? Is it justified? How do we think about that? And lastly, how do we manage the flow in a world where people are very savvy and know that what's not available here in the US can be got somewhere else? How do we deal with that reality, and how do we deal with the citizenship and the rights of the children they try to bring back? Okay, gene editing. Editing our genes, editing ourselves. I'm going to be a little bit briefer here because this one's been in the news a bit more, so my guess is you know a little bit more about this. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics defines genome editing as the practice of making targeted interventions at the molecular level of DNA and RNA function, deliberately to alter the structure or functional characteristics of biological entities. CRISPR, which you probably heard about, stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Palindromic Repeats, chunks of regularly recurring bits of DNA. To simplify greatly, and I want to emphasize for any of the scientists who are watching, the greatly part, right? In CRISPR-Cas9, which is one popular way of doing this, you can deploy a guide RNA that can sniff out a particular block or code in any living cell, say a genetic defect or an undesirable plant trait. You just need to make the complementary RNA sequence to the DNA you want to target. They then inject this short sequence of RNA, along with Cas9, into the cell they're trying to edit. The guide RNA forms a complex with Cas9, and one end of the RNA forms a hairpin curve that keeps it stuck in the protein, while the other, the business end if you will, dangles out to interact with any DNA it comes across. When they target the sequences detects, the RNA triggers Cas9 to produce 2 pincer-like appendages, which literally cut the DNA in 2. The process can stop there and simply take something out, or scientists can add a bit of replacement DNA to repair a gene instead of knocking it out. And they don't have to limit themselves to Cas9. There's a whole bunch of proteins that can be used as RNA guides. CRISPR isn't perfect. Sometimes the protein veers off course and makes cut at an unintended site. So scientists are actively working on ways to minimize these off-target effects. The main benefits for humans will be in improving our understanding of health and disease, treating diseases, and avoiding diseases through early genetic interventions. In August 2017, Nature published a report on an experiment by Shukrat Metalipov, who we had here last week actually for something the Petrie-Flom Center did, of the Oregon Health and Science University, showing it's possible to edit out and safely and efficiently a gene associated with heart disease in a human embryo for implantation in the womb. But because it's prohibited by US law, it didn't go the further step of actually implanting the embryo. So after reviewing the basic science, I'm going to tell the story of Dr. He up here, who shocked the world in December 2018 by announcing that despite all scientific consensus to the contrary, that we should not be doing this yet, that we just don't know enough, that he had edited the genes of 2 twin baby girls. The gene he targeted, called CCR5, creates a protein that makes it possible for the HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, to infect people's cells. With the help of an HIV/AIDS advocacy organization in China, he recruited a couples in which the man had HIV and the woman did not. He used CRISPR-Cas9 to try to disable the CCR5 gene in the embryos with the goal, he said, of creating babies who would be resistant to HIV infections. It's not at all clear that he succeeded, by the way, and even if he did succeed, it's not clear that he gave immunity for more than the HIV-1 strain. The move led to a global moratorium that we're still talking about now. Actually, we have an event next week at the STS program at the Kennedy School on exactly this topic. When we think about the legal and ethical issues raised here, it's necessary to distinguish somatic from germline gene editing. Somatic involves altering the non-reproductive cells for the purpose of treating or preventing diseases. For example, for people with advanced cancer that has failed to respond to conventional treatments like radiation and chemotherapy. In this study, genome editing is being used to program patients' immune cells to target the cancer. That's often called gene therapy. By contrast, here we're talking about germline alterations, ones that will be passed forward in terms of reproductive. The somatic raise new questions, but to be perfectly honest, they're questions that FDA and our existing law are pretty well equipped to handle. By contrast, it seems as though the germline stuff is really transformational and raises huge and difficult questions. Questions about when we should allow it, questions about the difference between enhancement and treatment, questions about inequality, questions about multi-generational follow-up, questions about consent from future generations and intergenerational justice, all questions I'm going to talk about in the book. Okay, one more and then we're done. And that is, finally, IVG. And this is the one that's most shocking to people. Do you know that you can make babies from skin? Of all the claims I make in the book, this one is the most startling to most readers. It's called in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG for short. To simplify the science, again, very greatly. Many stem cells, the building block for much of our bodies, start off in a pluripotent state and then differentiate into particular kinds of cells, skin rather than heart, for example. It's possible, though, to take adult cells, say a tiny bit of my skin, and induce the cells back into a pluripotent state. From that state, we can then cause them to differentiate into sperm or egg, and we can use that to make embryos. Scientists have already successfully done this in mice, and indeed, perhaps more shockingly, they've used this technology to create cross-sex gametes. That is, to derive sperm from adult females, right? So I'll say that one more time. Adult females producing sperm that could be used to inseminate an egg. Scientists have not yet undertaken to do the same thing in human beings, but that's more about ethical concerns than it is about something special about human biology that makes it impossible. Among those who would directly benefit include the carriers of certain genetic diseases, those who have undergone certain cancer treatments, and those who faced premature menopause. But it is possible that IVG will be used in such a way to extend the boundaries of reproduction still further. Of all the ones I've talked about in this book, this one is likely the most disruptive. Traditionally, reproduction was all about sex. The first reproductive revolution showed us that we could combine the gametes we typically put together through sex outside of the body. But IVG might have a much more radical effect that my friend Hank Greeley calls the end of sex. Don't worry, we'll still do it for fun, but in the future he suggests nobody will ever engage in sexual reproduction when they could instead use their skin cells to painlessly create thousands of embryos and then take all of those embryos, biopsy them, perhaps combine with gene editing them, and then put them into a person for reproduction. That, for some people, is a really exciting future. For others, it's a terrifying future. And part of this chapter is to examine which of the two we should think it is. Among the issues we'll talk about, currently, those using reproductive technologies are limited to the number of embryos they can create, particularly the inconvenience and health risks to women. The fact that IVG may help women avoid that is all for the good. But will it usher in an era of embryo farming, individuals producing hundreds or thousands of embryos they'll never use, sitting there in a frozen wasteland? Is this ultimately a positive development for our species, or is it a terrifying one? What happens to all those embryos created but not used? Will we see a market for embryos, not just sperm or egg, but actual embryos in frozen? What about the risks of unauthorized use of our cells to make gametes, absent explicit consent? In the most extreme case, imagine an individual uses sloughed skin left on a bathtub by Brad Pitt, for example, to derive his sperm, or possibly in the future, maybe his egg, or and the like, and uses that to reproduce. Is Brad Pitt the father in this case? If a child does result, does Brad Pitt have legal, social, or ethical responsibilities to the child? So far, the courts have had very little experience with such non-consensual parenthood. There's some cases about it, but we're going to face this rapidly. And here, I can't help but mention that when they hired me on the faculty 10 years ago, right, this was a central part, this technology. I was saying in the future, we might be able to do this kind of thing. We should talk about the right not to be a genetic parent. Well, I waited 10 years, but finally I was right? We can do it. So Harvard Law School made a good investment, right? I'm a stock that have paid out, at least in this one small venture. To what extent will IVG usher in equality for same-sex couples? It may mean that, at least for women, not only can they co-parent together, but they can both be genetic parents. One woman would provide the sperm. I'll say that again. One woman would provide the sperm, the other would provide the egg, and they would have a child who is both of theirs. Is there equality claims that might be marshaled to allow this technology to go forward? The terrain is very murky, but could there be a constitutional right to be a genetic parent? Could there actually be a constitutional right to be a genetic parent on both sides, to produce both the sperm and the egg for the child, or in the future, possibly to have 18 or 20 people involved in the genetic contribution to the child? Finally, how does IVG change our idea of what it would mean to be a parent? In a world where any of us could be genetic mother or father to thousands of children without ever engaging in sex or any reproductive technology, does it change our notion of what parenthood is and what parenthood is for? Does IVG take us to a place to question the importance of genetic relationships in our society, to get over the genetic connection, or does it instead reify it? Would it be better to live in a society that got over the genetic bond as the marker of families, that instead should we view this as a destabilizing threat to social cohesion or a welcome moment for triumph? Okay, one more slide just to thank all of the artists and the other people whose work I've used to show you these slides. And I want to close uncharacteristically for me with a prayer. I say uncharacteristically because I'm an avowed secularist in my work, but nonetheless, this is one I learned just of last week from a colleague. It's from Thomas à Kempis, who was a German-Dutch canon regular who died in 1471, and one of whose prayers I really liked had a little provision I want to share with you. And that is, "Do not let me judge by what I see, nor pass sentence according to what I hear, but to judge rightly between things that differ." Say that last bit again. To judge rightly between things that differ. If in my work I can achieve even a measure of that, I will die a very happy person. Thank you very much.
So we have in recognition of the chair and the chair lecturer, we have a gift for you, Professor Cohen. Would you like to unveil it?
Okay, wait 1 second. I need a little bit of drama as I do it. James A. Attwood and Leslie Williams, Professor of Law.